Okay. I think we'll get started. Good evening, and thank you all for coming. I am both thrilled and honored to have been asked to introduce our lecturer tonight, Daniel Bonilla. Did I say it right? It is Daniel, not Daniel. And Daniel has been invited to lecture tonight as part of our GSD Arts and Doctor class. Am I saying it right? Which is the speaker series for the Andes Initiative at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, if you don't know. Daniel is coming to us from Bogotá, Colombia, literally just last night, where he is considered one of the most promising architects in Latin America today. I can say that. Daniel graduated in architecture at the University of Los Andes in Bogotá, and then later studied urban design at Oxford Brookes University in England, College of Technology in Dublin, and the Milan Polytechnic. After working at the Public Space Bureau for the local authority central offices of Bogotá for several years, very savvy beginning, I must say, and then several architectural offices, including Llewelyn-Davies in London and Ospinas y Cia in Bogotá. Daniel then decided to open his own firm, Daniel Bonilla Architects, in 1997. Since then, his work has been published widely in Latin America as well as internationally in publications such as Under 40, A Young Generation of International Architecture by Fiden, 10 by 10 by 2, among many others, and was chosen by Architectural Record in 2008 in their prestigious Design Vanguard issue and list that year. His work has won many awards, both nationally and internationally as well, and has been exhibited in several biennials in countries including Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and of course, Colombia. He has lectured extensively throughout Latin America, the US, and Europe, and in fact was involved in our GSD Latin America conference, was it 06? A little while ago, okay. So we are thrilled to have him back tonight, to have the luxury of hearing more about his work. So tonight, Daniel's lecture is titled Dissolving the Boundary, which I think aptly describes how he approaches his fast becoming prolific body of work, particularly within the context of Bogotá. I had the wonderful advantage of actually seeing him lecture about a year ago. And so I'm actually speaking from some knowledge about his work through actually hearing him talk about it. And, you know, the boundary between public and private is a very common interest among architects, but it's a very pressing urban condition, especially as we face, I would say, the demise or reinterpretation of the institution as we know it, which I think will be very relevant, I think, for the work that he's going to show tonight. I'm not sure what he's showing tonight. And the growing trend of this hybridized program and unprogrammed public space. But in a city such as Bogotá, I think you'll see tonight how this is particularly relevant. His work covers various scales and typologies, including schools, university buildings, chapels, social housing, hotels, transit stations, and even street furniture. While it is often institutional in scale, it is quite intimate in detail. He has invented an architecture that addresses the challenges of both the desire for a new, more public and inclusive identity for the city of Bogotá, with the concerns and difficulties of day-to-day security there. In a city of many walls, and I mean it, so many walls, from what I remember from your lecture before, and defined boundary conditions, Daniel works through an architecture that focuses on both understanding and dissolving, to use his word, or let's say reworking the boundary conditions so artfully through often simple yet sometimes massive building forms in conjunction with, and often contrasted by, a delicate scale and sensibility toward the fine detail and high craft. He's interested in how building envelopes and interiors redefine the relationship to the city through what he refers to as tissues and textures rather than walls and glass, such as in the International Convention Center at Medellin and the Los Andes University Julio Mario Santo Domingo building, where here we see a skill for overlaying monumental form with a series of finely crafted screen walls that wrap throughout the project, which I hope we'll see tonight. I think it is also worth noting, as I introduce him, that most of his projects have come from winning open public competitions, such as the Colombian Expo Hanover 2000 Pavilion and the Chapinero Chamber of Commerce of Bogotá building. Yet I have to say, I think some of his most beautiful and conceptually complete work has come out of a series of chapels that he has done in surrounding Colombia. I think that these are some of the most beautiful projects where you can really see the culmination of your desire, his desire to reinvent place, program, and social relationships through simple form, envelope, and again, a passion for craft. So I think you're in for a real treat tonight. I'm glad we got a really good showing this evening, discovering more about the city of Bogotá in Colombia through the wonderful work of Daniel Bonilla. So help me give a warm welcome to Daniel Bonilla.
Good evening. Are you listening to me? Yes, okay? I don't know if this is working. Is it working? Okay. Right. So I would like to start saying thank you to the GSD. Thank you to Beth and all the people organizing this event. And of course, it's for me a great honor and a pleasure to be here. And I always say at the beginning of these lectures, especially when I come to the States, because I've been coming for quite many times recently, that it's very interesting to see how the relationship between knowledge is changing. So when I was studying in Colombia, we used to study a lot about what was going on the northern hemisphere of the Earth. And we used to study about architects, about culture, about social habits, religion, so on, so on, so on, so on. So it was very important and education in Colombia to get to know about the world. But that world, in terms of that time, seems to be a knowledge coming from the north to the south. What is beautiful about these processes now is I see that there is a lot of interest of getting to know about southern cultures on the earth. And that is very interesting in the sense that there is a lot of relationship of information going north and south, which I believe is a very good way to encourage people to understand about the world, but also to understand about architecture and about culture. So thank you for the invitation, and I hope you enjoy what I'm going to show. So I'm going to start because I know probably you know very little about Colombia. So what I want to do is to start showing about Bogotá, the city where I grew up, and the city where I work. And that's going to be like a kind of introduction of the country. And then I'm going to show some of the work that I had done during the last 10 years. And basically, I would like to emphasize about some concepts that we have developed, and they are related to this idea of the dissolving of the age. So this is Bogotá. This is a view of the city. This is a city that is almost on the equator line. It's 2,600 meters above sea level. So we have no seasons, which is something very interesting. I mean, for us, seasons are the rare thing. Whereas here, not to have seasons is a very kind of rare thing. And it's a lot related to how you develop a culture within that condition. So it's a flat city surrounded by mountains. And of course, we have this idea of, a pattern of the city that is quite dense, blocks that are quite densely developed, together with some rise tall buildings. But that's not a common pattern. That will be the rare pattern. Mostly the cities like that. But something that is very unique about Colombia and Latin America in general terms is this mixture between the city done by architects, a city done by non-architects. So this is a kind of typical pattern of Bogotá. So about the 50% of the city is being developed like this, which to us has been a kind of lab and a kind of knowledge to take from. So as students at the university, we study a lot about this type of typology of the city. But also as architects, I believe this is a very important place where to get knowledge from. So this kind of idea of self-development and how the city is viewed by a self-development, by not using architects, that achieve certain kind of a relationship between community and relationship between inhabitants. So we drew this plan in the office recently, just to try to find out where those places are. I mean, the purple color is related to this, what I call informal city, and the blue color is about formal city. But what is very interesting is that I remember a few years ago, there was this architect from Spain, Eduardo Arroyo, who I was taking around the city, and I was talking about this to him. And he didn't understand, and he didn't realize what was the difference on those two cities. Because at the end, it's not so visible as you think. So we separate these two maps just to try to find out what was the imprint on the geographic area of the city. And we just then create a percentage. That happened to be on a relationship of 1/4 towards 3/4. But at the end, it's half of the population. So there's a lot of difference between density in both cities. And this is the texture of an informal city. So you see the way how normally these houses will be developed by 2 or 3 floors. So they will be developed by time to time. So it's a kind of self-finance system. So every inhabitant put money on the house when the money is available. And then what is really interesting about this and is fascinating is this. You see the life that is produced on the street by this informal city and the relationship of activities. So it's always a very active city. You see the footpath is not even enough. So even the road is being taken by people. And there are a lot of shops on ground floor. So it's a kind of very beautiful mixed and intense city. And also it's a lot related with economy. So somebody who owns this house can have a shop under. So it's a way to get income from the city. And what is really interesting about this is if we are able as architects to copy and to learn from this type of pattern. At the same time, we had what I call the formal city, and you see the texture is not so far from what I saw before. But what is really different is what is being produced on the street. So here, this will be a typical like middle-income development, surrounded by a fence, and you will see the activities. There is a very little activity on that, which is always a question about this. So basically, what we have done with this is just to have a view on them and to have like a thoughts taken from those type of situations. But this is the traditional city at the same time. So this is the main square of Bogotá, which is the main square at the end of the country, because Bogotá is the main city of the country. So that will be our most significant space. And it's a kind of typical, is in within the Spanish pattern of development. So the main square is a rectangular square surrounded by the church, that's the Congress, and that's the mayor office of the city. And here is the Justice Palace. And again, what is interesting of these places is the amount of activity. And that activity is not only taken on those significant spaces, it's being taken all over the city by simple things like footpaths and cycle routes and cycleways. And I'm going to talk about this later on. But what is interesting about these two photographs is this idea of humanizing the space. So this photograph, this is a kind of cell-made cycleway. But here on the right, you see is the cycleway here, and these are roads that on Sundays they become cycleways too. So on Sundays we had 250 kilometers of new road that had been taken just for people to cycle. And that's been on for 35 years, which is a very significant thing. And so the meaning of this is that even a road could be like a kind of human space, even a road that's supposed to be the less human space in terms of relationship. And also, Bogotá had developed during different times this idea of a network of parks. So there are big parks, but at the same time there are very many small parks, because there is a regulation. If people want to do like a complex of houses, there is a percentage that has to be done on parks, And that becomes like a very spread network of green system. So this is a typical picture on Sunday. This is the main park of the city. And what is beautiful about this is you see the kind of activity that happens. We have 42% of poorness on the country, which is a very high rate. And what is beautiful about this activity hasn't need any money to do it. So people walk or take a bus and go to these major parks to do a very simple activities. But what is beautiful is this activity is being creating a sense of a community and sense of encounter. And also it's being created a sense of equality, because here in the park, everyone is equal. In a country that you have big difference, that has a lot of value. And also we have a very strong tradition of brick architecture, which is called the architecture of the place. It has been called like that. This is Rogelio Salmona's Torres del Parque, which are very significant in the way that they became a very important way of thinking on architecture. So during about 30 years, there was a single way to look on architecture, which was related to this, and it was related to this fascinating and beautiful brick that we have. And that created like a single way of looking on architecture and a single way of belief, which is very unique. I mean, normally what you tend to find everywhere are different ways of thinking on architecture, but we have for 40 years a single way of thinking on architecture. And also when we graduate from university, we start looking on those pictures and taking like a simple ideas from. In this case, we fill the voids of the windows, and just to try to find patterns between formal city and informal city. And that was we did many collages on that time, but that was just saying a way to understand the city and a way to try to make an understanding of a view. You see? And that was like a very simple exercise. We didn't pretend to do something deep or anything like build a theory or anything like that. We just tried to manipulate visuals of the city to try to understand the quality of the city. And also, there was this kind of very important issue that we have in Colombia, because everybody knows there is a problem with security. But security affects the city by these things, you know. What is interesting about these two photographs, they are taken 50 meters away from each other. So this building is the same building, and this building is this one. But just by putting a fence, you change immediately the meaning and the quality of the space and the relationship of the space. So it's been a long discussion about how to fence buildings, and of course, people have this idea of protecting themselves by using a simple fence, which is very aggressive. And also, it's been a lot of work on trying to understand how to do this in a much better way. And it's been done not only by the architects, but it's also been done by the public authorities in Bogotá and how to control these type of things. Still, there are a lot of fences around the city, which is really a very bad relationship between buildings and city. But I always wonder, when you fence a building, what are you fencing? You know, here, in this photograph, you see children, but you see, I don't know who is fenced by the fence. You see, the wall or the children, which is very fascinating things, because at the end, when you, actually, I was surprised yesterday when I was walking around to see how many fences here around the area of Harvard Square, which I was surprised, because I expected to be a more like a free area, but it seems to be fenced also. And it seems to be fenced for the same silly reason of bad understanding of protection, which I don't believe necessarily has to be done in this way. Something that has been very unique to us in Bogotá is this sequence of mayors who have been very significant for the understanding of the city and for the understanding of how you can grow up a culture within a city. So this is a list of few mayors of the city. I don't have the last two mayors now here. But what is significant is I just, let me just pass to the next one, which is in English, sorry. I try to place some statements from these mayors, but not the main statements. I just try to point out simple statements that they try to achieve. And because you tend to understand the history always by main events. But I always believe that the history is built by very simple events adding in a sequence. So we happened to have a mayor twice, this guy who happened to be a philosopher. And what was interesting about this period on the history of Bogota was that this philosopher didn't belong to a political party. That means that this philosopher was elected without a political network behind him. And that became like an icon in terms of the history of politics in the country. And also it also became very significant because he spent, for the first election, he spent $2.5 million pesos, which is around $5,000 in the whole campaign, which was extremely significant also as a way of meaning and understanding how politics can be moved and can be different. And I showed this also because it was a very significant, like a link from one mayor to another to achieve a very interesting connection with the people. So in the case of the philosopher, on the first period that he was elected, the city didn't have any money at all. So he started working with these memos just to try to give people messages about the city. And the messages were very simple. This is an example. The example is, you see there is this bus trying to turn around, and there is a pedestrian crossing, and the bus is on the pedestrian crossing, so the memo has the word incorrect. You see, so it's a very simple way to say and to make people to understand good habits and bad habits related to the city and to the way of using the city and to and the way of behaving in a kind of urban places. And then also he did this, which is very sort of valuable and very sort of, because there are a lot of things here related to not the value of what they achieve directly, is the value of what they achieve in people's minds. It's different. It's how to build a perception of a place. So this thing was called the carrot hour. And the carrot is because means, it's quite difficult to translate, but to be zanahorio, which is the word in Spanish, means like to be in the sense innocent, or to be like a good behaving, you know? And in this case, the bars used to be closing at 3 a.m. in the morning in Bogota. So the mayor asked for a law to close them at 11. And that was because there was a certain amount of people being fighting and having like a violence, or people driving with alcohol. And so the mayor established this idea: if the city is not behaving well, I punish them by closing the bar at 11, which is a real pain for Colombians. You know, we are Latin, so we love parties. So there was a lot of complaint by the bars owners. But what was significant, it was the first weekend, the rate on accidents decreased by half. So it was extremely significant. And at the end, there was only one condition for the bars to be closing late again. It was, if the city behaves properly, I allow you to go late at night on bars. Which, again, what is beautiful about these things is just a written paper. It's a kind of, it's 2 sentences law, but it has a lot of impact because everyone was talking about these kind of conditions and complaining, and people were happy at the same time. So what is beautiful about these type of actions, they seem to be very, very insignificant, very small, but that they have a lot of impact in terms of people's minds. So after 6 months, the city was closing the bars around 1, and after a year, the city was closing around 3 a.m., with half of the average of damages and rates or violence at night. So that means that by creating laws, you can achieve a lot of changes in people's minds and people's behavior. Then there was another of the mayors implemented this, the day without a car, which is, it was very interesting because we were called to vote for this. So we all vote, and 76% of the population vote yes for the day without a car, which means one day a year without a car, without a private car. And we bought that to happen for the next 25 years on the city, and that was, I think, about 9 years ago. So that means that the city is having this day every year, which is very significant. But what is interesting about this is, again, always this discussion about cars and people, and putting that discussion, bringing the discussion to the current people, not to professional, not to architects, it's to everyone. And also achieving people to think on other means of transport, which is also very significant. And then what is also interesting, the three majors on the list, this one, and this one, they became a party. So they are called the Green Party. They were called the Green Party because what was interesting also, they were, as individuals, they were very interesting people, very fascinating, with very fascinating ideas. But then they tried to build up a party, and the party collapsed. So the party didn't operate properly, and the party only lasts for about a year. It's still on the party, but it's almost disappeared. So again, I wonder why individuals are so good when they are individuals, but then when they come together and try to create a party, political party, becomes a problem. And something that was beautiful about this is they put this image of a fish catching a fish, and this is like bicycles and these are cars, and trying to again put this idea of something that is simple is a car in a city and how the car could relate it to people, and when people can use a car and when not. And there is something else that I want to show you is about competitions. We have a very interesting law in the country that was implemented in 1992. And that was a law making compulsory public buildings on a public tenders. So the country opened a public competition for architects. And that was very valuable, and that was the way how many offices on that time started getting work, like in the case of our office. And what is interesting on this is how you open to everyone the possibility of doing a building, very important buildings because they are the public buildings, and how you open that just for the value of the merits. If you do the work properly, you present a good proposal, you get the commission. And that's something very unique in Latin America. I haven't seen anything similar there are competitions everywhere, but the only country in Latin America that has this law that makes competition compulsory is Colombia, and it's been also very significant for the quality of the buildings that we have achieved. So here many examples, probably you have seen some of them, and what is beautiful is this is taking over all the country, but especially Bogotá and Medellin. And here is some of the students from Luis Callejas. You see this is one of his buildings. Here are two photographs of this swimming pools complex. And what is beautiful about this type of commissions and to achieve this kind of quality was possible without any experience or any age. So if you do a good proposal, you can be very young, you achieve the contract by doing a good proposal, and that's it. And it's been very significant for the country because we have achieved this idea of having good architecture for everyone and having good public buildings for everyone. That means that the money on taxes are well invested, which is also, again, a kind of very important meaning for the people. So here, I finish with this introduction about Colombia. It's sorry to be a bit long, but I think it's a quite important introduction for getting to know about Colombia. And now I'm going to jump to my work, the work that we do in the office. This is a chart. And what is interesting about this chart is this chart summarizes the kind of work principles or the work aims that we develop in every single project. So here there are some buildings, and here these are the topics that we develop on those buildings. And basically we had built up this approach to architecture, which is a kind of physical and conceptual approach at the same time. I'm going to be talking mostly about here. So normally I talk about the six together, but tonight I just want to talk about these ones because in the sense I want to concentrate on just showing one aspect of the work that we do. And that's basically about something that I call this idea of mutability of flexibility that is related with the boundaries and with the dissolving of the boundaries. And there's this idea of boundaries, the concern about the idea of boundaries came by two reasons. One reason was by the fact that we look at architecture and try to find the way how architecture could be more flexible and could be more, permeable and more possible to do different activities. And then we found that this graphic is very interesting because it shows that the ability that the space has to change itself is just the boundaries between the walls. And those boundaries are fixed. So at the end, the conclusion to us was a very simple. I mean, mostly what we have and trying to build up are very simple ideas and very simple conclusions. So this is the conclusion that the space in architecture is fixed. And the flexibility and the ability of dissolving the edge is related to furniture. So we thought that values in architecture should expand not only by seeing in that way. And here are an example of this idea of a boundary and how something that has a meaning can change its meaning by a simple way of operating it. And there are some other like more strong ways of doing it. And so by transporting things or by deflecting things and pushing things around or by extension. So these kind of simple things always what are beautiful is that they change the relationships and the boundaries. You see, one thing is like that and the other thing is when it's expanded. The whole relation of the space and the use of the space, it changes. And also the relation that you can achieve by providing to the space more possibilities of being used. And one of this simple example will be a tent, like a circus tent, which is interesting is how you take a building from one place to another. So you change the whole relation of the building. And even these kind of ideas of how you can place a grid and then you can add or subtract elements and create a different program. And also, with this idea of dissolving the edge, we also came out with this concept of mutations. So how a building can mutate by using architecture, or how a building by architecture can mutate. And this is something that we have sort of been interested on and been trying to do in some research. And of course, this idea from the 80s about with the Archigram group about movable cities, which is a kind of utopia, but it's an utopia that is being built out with some knowledge. And also about this idea of flexibility, which is a kind of simple way of understanding flexibility. In this case, if you have a wall and then you remove a wall, how you dissolve the edge of the interior and you relate it toward the exterior, and the whole thing becomes one space. But you don't have a clear or a tight understanding what is inside and what is outside. So that's a very sort of fascinating thing that we have looked at and we try to develop in the work that we do. So basically, I'm going to show you 7 examples of 7 buildings that we have done with this view. You know, it's how you dissolve this edge and the ways of dissolving these edges. So here is a competition that we did in Sao Paulo. That was a competition about social housing. We won this competition. And basically what they were looking at, they were asking for a building that they could repeat anywhere in the city of Sao Paulo to produce a massive solution for social housing. And of course, we were concerned about the city and how the city relates towards the building, but this idea of how public space comes into a private space and how the edge diffuse. But especially in this case, what was really interesting was this idea, which is again, to my view, is a kind of traditional way of thinking on flexibility, which is, in this case, we make a very simple rectangular space with toilets and kitchen at the back, and then at the front, just some partition that can be movable. So people were able to change the flats during time. So this is, to my view, the traditional way how architecture is being flexible and is being changing its limits. And this is I mean, it could be done anywhere. Every building has concrete columns. You can pull down the walls, and by doing so, you achieve some flexibility. But at the same time, it's inflexible. What is the operation to do this, unless you build these partitions on a very simple materials, the operation of changing it becomes a kind of massive and disruptive operation. So we did that in the two kind of spaces, the large apartment and the small apartment. And at the end, we also did that the building has an envelope that allows that. So allows different types of spaces inside of the building. So this is a kind of, to me, is a kind of very simple, minimal operation that achieves, in the sense, flexibility, and somehow provides the opportunity of dissolving what is in the building and recreating the building in a different way. So that will be like what I call the kind of sort of traditional type of example with some achievement on flexibility. We also have tried to work on more sort of idea of dissolving these edges with elements. And this is a house in an island of it's an island on the Caribbean, a Colombian island on the Caribbean. This is a typical traditional architecture there, which is a wooden architecture, somehow a kind of simple wooden architecture. The landscape and the place is absolutely fantastic. But basically what we propose for this, this is a house that is going to be used just a few periods of the year. So basically what we thought here, what we could do, it was to propose a house that it was like a single roof, and that roof will allocate a space with columns under. So that was the kind of. What is important about this is at the end, we just wanted to have a roof and to have like a very simple partitions. Those partitions, they don't need to be fixed. So at the end, what we have is columns and a roof. And by doing so, what was interesting about this is this idea of the relationship exterior-interior and how there was not like a single edge. So what is, you have to understand that the weather here is stable. It doesn't change through the year. So it's the Caribbean. But what is absolutely interesting and fascinating about this is that just by putting a roof and putting like a floor, you don't need anything else to cover, but basically what you need is to cover. So the whole relation in this building about flexibility and about dissolving the edge was to relate just with the roof. So these are just simple images about how that, I mean, what is interesting about this issue is that you don't need to isolate the building. You don't need to seal the building. You don't need to enclose the spaces. Basically, you need is, what you have is this relationship between landscape and the roof at the end, because basically this is like a roof. So we create this idea of the two roofs, and of course we were concerned about how those roofs were the less possible obstructed in the place. So this is another way to see this idea of flexibility. And then another idea is what I call mutability. And this is something that we have to achieve by operating certain parts of the building. So this is Los Nogales Chapel. This chapel is being built in a very stable material. It's concrete. So it's a kind of unmovable material. But we had mixed this with wood. And then basically what we had done in this case was to allocate the possibility for the building to change, and to change in terms of the size. So we developed the idea of having one facade that is closed, so it's this facade. But we developed the idea that that facade could open. And by opening the facade, the whole meaning and understanding of the building changes. Because when the facade is closed, the building inside axis is around this way, but when it's open, the axis is this way. But it's not only the axis that changes, it changes the typology of what happened with the building. So section of the building becomes at the same time facade. And also, it gives us a lot of opportunities to have a building that is 300 square meters, and the building allows up to 2,000 people to be related to the building. So here, we have achieved this idea by using and doing in a small building. The building can be more public, and can be more public is because the building allows to have more people on the operation. So the other interesting thing is the parts of the building, so the nave of the building, and the choir and the altar, which is the kind of, that will be the layout of the building when it's closed, it changes. When it's open, the altar is here, and the choir is here. So even the parts of the buildings are not fixed. So the parts of the building change in terms of the meaning. So that's why we call it that there is a mutation in this. And this is just basically by operating a single wall. There was a video here that I don't think is taking the video. It's not taking. And the other thing that is significant is how the meaning of a mass changes. In this case, the way how it happens a big mass now is the priest come walking and opens the door. So it becomes like a kind of very emotional thing when you see that those big doors open, and there is this a kind of a scenographic, but at the same time happening activity related with architecture. So here are some pictures just to see how it relates to the building. So at the end, the question is, in this case, and the achievement is how on a small building could be at the same time a large building, and how you can achieve big masses on a small space. So this is the interior space. And this interior space has been, something that is interesting about these type of buildings is also the students of the school are taking those buildings as a way of educating, as a way of creating knowledge. And then the other, there's another building here that I want to show you. Let me see. Where is that one? Okay, here. Another way of changing and mutations and allowing flexibility in a building. This was a competition, one of these public competitions, about a pavilion that should be placed in Hanover on the fair. And basically, we faced the competition on thinking on the pavilion as an industrial building. So that was a structure that should be repeated. And by repeating this structure, we allow a building to be placed on a single fair for a few months, but then the building should be taken somewhere else. So that was not part of the brief of the competition. We basically, that was the main reason why we won the competition, was because we thought in putting a building, that the building should go somewhere else afterwards. We didn't know where, but we thought that was a particular quality for the building. So we created this kind of industrial big shape that should be produced in Colombia, taking a boat, being set up in the fair, during the fair. And then what was important on this is the country was able to sell this building to be replaced and to be placed somewhere else. So the achievement of flexibility and this idea of no edge in this case is that the building itself can move from one place to another. So then the building was sold by a public tender. It was bought by a city called Hanover. And they placed the building just beside a lake. So that's where the building is now. And it's very fascinating, this idea that you produce something that has no place or have a place for 6 months, and then you replace it, and it building goes somewhere else. And in this case, even the idea of mutation, the building became, it was the Colombian pavilion for 6 months on the fair, but then it became a restaurant. So it's a single restaurant just placed in the city in Germany afterwards. So the whole meaning of the use of the building changes itself. That's the menu, because it's called the Colombian Pavilion, but they sell dishes like Machu Picchu meat and churrasco and so many. So that's why I try to introduce the country in the way, because I understand not everyone has a particular understanding of South America. And then another example is this building, La Carrera Chapel. And here, this is a kind of mutation again. It's very similar in terms of concept to the other chapel. In this case, it's a building being set within the landscape. And basically what we tried to achieve was a very simple building, like a minimum kind of spaces and shapes, because we were so concerned about the landscape surrounded by. But we tried to make this building to achieve this idea of reshaping the parts of the building in terms of how the building could be, again, flexible, and how the building can be, by operating some of the parts of the building, can be changed. In this case, we use two materials. We try to use always two materials to produce architecture. And in this case, there were materials around the area, like this stone or the wood, the local wood. But what was interesting about this building, in this building there is also a relationship between this idea of tissues. So although I'm not talking about tissues tonight, this is a typical example of the work that we have developed about this idea of skin and envelopes. And in this case, we basically make this building to happen on this idea of flexibility. And this diagram shows a bit about it. So this is a building when it's closed, and when the building opens, there is this relationship between the kind of classical view towards religious architecture, done in a sort of interpretative way. So in this, the volume just slides, and by sliding the volume, we achieve this idea of this opening that becomes very important for a mass of more than 30 people, because when it's enclosed, the building just allows 30 people to be there. And again, here you see the meanings and the parts of the building changes. So one thing is when the building is closed, and one thing is when the building is open. The meanings of the parts are completely different. Let's see if this video works. And basically, what is important about this is we have been very concerned about how make flexible architecture with architecture. And in this case, again, this is about the same that we saw in the other chapel, is how to make this thing by a simple operation, how to make it to allow people to work in certain way with the building. So in this case, when the building is closed, you have like a axis in this way, and when it's open, the axis is this way. And of course, there is more capacity for the people to be there when it's open. So here is something else that happens to these relationships, because when this building is open, there's no glass here, there is just air in between, and facades become the landscape. We solved the idea of tissue in this case by using this wood, and we try to sew the wood and by using these panels. And by the repetition of these panels, in a simple metal structure, by putting those panels one beside the other one. We achieved this this idea of like a pattern that runs and what I call an endless pattern, because it could be longer or smaller. And at the end, what is beautiful about this way of thinking is that it could be endless in the way how it's being told. And of course, it has a certain proportion between what is void and what is solid. And this solid and this addition gives a particular inside lighting and a relationship between outdoor and indoor that is a kind of tamiz. So it's not a direct relationship about what you achieve with the window. When you open a window, and you can see straight away. The window is all of this, but the window is at the same time is kind of translucent. And in this chapel, basically the idea came from this forest. When we first arrived to the place, they cut this forest. It was a next neighbor of the land, and they cut this forest. So we tried to recreate this idea of the forest on the facade. So again, what is important here is how, by architecture, you can achieve this idea of flexibility and this idea of making the building more than the size allows it. And I'm going to run to this other building. This is a commercial housing building, housing flat in Bogotá. And it has nothing special in particular. It's a typical regulation of the city when you had to place one building beside the other one. So it's a kind of building in between. And it was a very tiny building. This is around, the plot was 300 square meters. So it was a really small plot with kind of typical small flats. But what is interesting about this is, in this case, we work with something that is extremely simple. I mean, I raise this issue about simple things that reconvert the meaning or the purpose of an architecture and the functionality. In this case, this is a kind of transformation achieved by a functional ramp. This ramp rises and goes down, again, by this idea of mobility. And what is important is that by doing so, we allow to have just by a single space the possibility to access. So it's a kind of movable. This is extremely simple, but in the same way is another way of achieving flexibility. And by doing this, you achieve certain simple things like having more space for the section of the building, having more car parking spaces. So it's a kind of very functional way of looking on flexibility. And the last example I'm going to show is this cafeteria. We just finished this building a few weeks ago. And again, it's this idea of boundaries and flexibility being achieved by, in this case, no movement. So we in the sense, thought in not using the movement as a way of achieving flexibility. So in this case, in the Colombia has earthquakes, and it's kind of like Mexico City in Bogotá. So the regulation is very strong. So if you do a column just like a circular column, it's not as efficient as if you do a column that has a certain length. So L-shaped columns or long columns become more efficient for earthquakes. So basically, in this case, we thought in using an L-shaped column, but then we thought that by moving the column around and by making the column, because you see it's a single column, but the column is placed on a rotation and also upside down. So it's a very simple operation on rotating the column and putting upside down the column at the same time. And that simple operation, what allows at the end is some, like a kind of very dynamic way of movement and flexibility, and also this kind of idea of the building being more dynamic in the sense. And by placing them together, you see what is interesting. This is a single frame, so the frame is exactly the same all over. But just by doing this operation, it tends to be like a more, how can I say, a more flexible and a more, less rigid building. And also in this case, it's particularly good for earthquakes. And even we tried to make it thinner. It was possible in terms of the engineering calculations. But then there was, on construction, there was a limitation about how to pour the concrete on the frame. So that's why at the end this is 12 centimeters, but it could be done even on 6 centimeters. But the problem was just how to do it on site. So that's why it ends on 12 centimeters. And again, this is a way how we perceive and we believe about this idea of flexibility and how you can make a building to be more than a single building. In this case, this is a cafeteria, but at the same time, it's a kind of main hall for the school. Okay, and just to finish, I want to, let me see if sorry. I don't think it's here. Okay, I just want to return to the chart. Just by saying that in this particular way of looking on architecture, we are researching on certain fields. And what is interesting about this chart is every year when we revise it, we move to a new fields, or we sort of give more importance to certain kind of tissues, certain kind of issues about this. And what I believe is this is a relation of concepts that are flexible, and those concepts, in the sense, are the way to have a target, which in the way how we see to architecture and in the way how we think, by doing simple things within simple budgets, we can achieve something more related to architecture, and we can contribute to a society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we'll take some questions. I don't know if this is on.
Yes.
Thank you. This is a fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I was very intrigued in the first part when you were talking about Bogotá. You showed, formal and informal housing. And Colombia has the largest population of displaced people in Latin America. I was wondering whether you felt, or you've experimented with, or you've thought of the implications of this type of flexible architecture for people like the people in Ciudad Bolívar who have been displaced from their homes.
Yes, we are doing now 2 projects on social housing. And basically, what I believe is, because I tell you something that is important. Because the cost that has to achieve social housing, a house for social housing in Colombia is sold for $20,000. So it's a really tiny, very tiny budget. And because that, the way how the house is built is taking just the simplest and more efficient way in terms of economics. So basically what normally is done now is there are walls, there are retaining walls, and you put the slabs on top of that. So those walls they have to be very close together to be very cheap. So it's like 2.50 meters around. And what happened with those houses, and my concern about those houses is in the future they are not going to be flexible. So you sell a house that is 2 rooms or 3 rooms in about 50 square meters. The rooms are very small, everything is quite small. And people in the future are not going to be able to move those houses in terms of at least the interior of those houses. And in that condition, what happened is that people will have to live forever with that type of architecture and that type of spaces. But what is going to happen in 10 years or 15 years is the structure of the family is going to change. So children are not going to be around, and they will be like probably third age people just in the house or whatever. And I believe that is going to tie people. And for that reason, what the kind of social housing that we are trying to do is more flexible in the way how we believe those spaces should be movable and should be flexible. And they are a bit related to what I show about Sao Paulo competition, is working on that way. What is very difficult in that case is the budgets are very, very slow. And the amount of space that you have to move is very tiny. So basically what we are trying to do is making the people to understand, because there is a cultural understanding for people, that if you don't have a wall on brick, it's not a wall. So we're trying to move from just giving the people the space and trying the people to build up the space from, which is also good because that means that you end in putting less money on walls and partitions. So you can give like a simple free space and people use it. And of course you have to do the plugs for the toilets and the kitchen. But then again, what we try to achieve there is something that is extremely simple, and that's why I show at the beginning the Sao Paulo competition. I don't know if that answers your question, sorry.
Yes and no, because sorry, I think that I believe that there's a difference between the people who have the culture of Bogota for the last 50 years and the people who are, first of all, who are coming into the city, who are displaced from rural areas. They're used to a different type of architecture. And secondly, thinking of your German example, that if the programs for getting displaced people back to their homes work, is there any thinking about being done about the sort of architecture that you could actually design that could then be transferred to back from where they are?
I didn't understand, sorry. Excuse me.
Do you mind if I just repeat it in Spanish? Estoy pensando en los desplazados que tiene otro modelo de pensar en su espacio y con el programa actual del gobierno de entregar tierra en los lugares de origen. Si eso funciona, si ustedes están pensando en un ejemplo como lo de Alemania.
Okay, I understand now. It's a very complex question. No, it's because probably you not all of you know, but this new president, which has been for about a year and a half now, he's been raising a campaign, and there is a new regulation of the country of giving back the land that it was taken to the people because we had this guerrilla for the last 50 years, and a lot of people had been taking over their own land and so on. So she's asking about if we are doing something related to these issues of people returning to their own land and what type of, say, architecture they require. But the answer is we haven't been able to work on that, and nobody's working on that at the moment. Because something that is very interesting about this issue is, it's 4 million people altogether. It's a huge amount. If the country is 46 million people, so this is around 8.5% of the people who have been moved by force from their own land, and they supposed to be able to start returning to their own land. And I believe what is going to happen is they're going to return to their own houses. That will be the basic idea. And at the same time, of course, I know there is a lot of programs from the government trying to build schools and institutional buildings all over the country. But it's only recently that there is and I say recently from probably 2.5 months ago, that there is this housing minister who is trying to rise up new houses. There's a target of 100,000 houses for these people. But it's going to be very complex because it's no houses. Those houses are in cities, so it's people who have moved to the city and they're going to remain and accept that they're going to stay in the city. And again, the target and the problem is efficiency, because those houses has to cost about $25,000 or something like that. So it's going to be very limited on the answer. And I don't see that there is any deep thinking on that. And I don't see also the universities working on that. Okay. Thank you very much.